Mes sugniuždyti.
We're in pieces.
Vokietija paskelbė
Germany has declared war.
Aliukas vasaros stovykloje.
Alec is at summer camp.
Negauname jokios žinios.
We can't get any information.
Sovietų kariuomenė traukėsi.
Soviet troops retreating.
Juos apšaudo lietuviai su baltais raiščiais.
Lithuanians with white armbands shooting at them.
Tėvai barasi gretimame kambaryje.
My parents shouting in the next room.
Virš mūsų galvų bombarduoja vokiečiai.
German bombing overhead. It's hard to write.
Esu Justina Petrulionytė Saboninė, Parodos Iš tamsos prodiuserė ir taip pat Kaunas Europos kultūros sostinė, programos Atminties biuras koordinatorė. Ši paroda, kaip ir kitos mūsų programos iniciatyvos, yra bandymas į šį miestą sugrąžinti įvairių tautų kauniečių istorijas, priminti likimus tų, iš kurių iš tiesų mes paveldėjome šį miestą. Jenny Kagan paroda iš tiesų pirmą kartą buvo pastatyta ir pristatyta visuomeniai Britanijoje 2016 metais, tačiau į Kauną Jenny parodą atveža jau truputėlį kitokią. Atveža ją papildytą su daugiau eksponatų ir daugiau istorijų. Atveža į Kauną todėl, kad iš tiesų šita istorija čia ir prasidėjo. Jenny Kagan pristatoma šeimos istorija, kuri iš tikrųjų yra tam tikras pamatas visos parodos, papasakoja daug didesnę dalelę Antrojo pasaulinio karo istorijos Lietuvoje ir Kaune. Paroda išskirtinė tuo, kad ji per labai asmenišką santykį, labai tokį aktyvų, interaktyvų santykį su žmogumi, su lankytoju, pasakoja istoriją. Ji efektyvi tuo, kad jį įtraukia į kelionę tam tikrą, į menininkės pasiūlytą trajektoriją, kaip keliauti per istoriją, kaip keliauti per šitą erdvę. Ir iš tikrųjų jinai tuo pačiu mums padeda pasimatuoti savo vertybes dabar, kai mes gyvenam tikro, ne hipotetinio karo akivaizdoje. Menininkė parodą pritaikė konkrečiai šiai erdvei. Visas modelis, viskas padaryta konkrečiai šitai erdvei. Ir tą pastatą mes maloniai gavome iš verslininkų. Šitas pastatas Gimnazijos gatvėje pastatytas XIX amžiuje ir turėjo įvairiausių istorijų ir įvairiausių funkcijų atliko per tą laikotarpį. Pastaraisiais dešimtmečiais Kaune jisai stovėjo apleistas. Dabartiniai savininkai pradėjo renovacijos darbus ir netikėtai susikirto mūsų keliai ir jie mus įsileido.
My name's Lewis Sharp. I'm here to I've designed and built most of the electronics. I designed and built it back in the UK, and now I'm sort of integrating it all together into these suitcases that when you open them up, they all perform a function. Like this one will, and when you open it up, it turns the light on, and then it produces the sound of a dive bomber. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There's 13 different boxes.
My name's David Willis. I came over with Jenny Kagan, the artist, to work on this piece to help put it together. So I'm here for 5 weeks in total. It's a big job to change the function of a building completely. We've been very lucky to have this building to use, but there's a lot of work to do to create the particular atmosphere that we want inside. I first came for a visit with Jenny for a recce July last year, so saw the building then, and we fell in love with it as the ideal space. Partly because of its location right in the middle of town, very close to lots of important sites that relate to the story that we're telling inside the building. It would be very different from back in the UK. I think the main thing about that is it's about Kaunas. It's all about Kaunas. So hopefully when people work their way through the exhibition and get to the end and they go out through the doors into the gardens at the presidential palace, they realise, oh my God, that story is about here. It's about us, it's about our lives. It's kind of come home, really, where the story began.
October 28th, 1941.
1941 metų spalio
This day when
28
destiny
diena.
is determined by the flick of a
Tai
finger.
diena, kai likimas nulemiamas piršto
The
spragtelėjimu.
entire population rises before dawn.
Visi Kauno geto gyventojai.
So I'm Jenny Kagan. I'm from England, from the UK, where I was born, and I'm here in Kaunas presenting Out of Darkness for Kaunas 2022. Out of Darkness is my presentation of the stories that my parents told me about their time in Kaunas. Stories that I heard from when I was a small child, and we talked about all their lives. And I know my mum was very keen always that their story was told. And it was only really after she died that I found a medium that worked for me, because my background's in theatre. I'm a theatre lighting designer. And originally I thought I'd try and write a book, but I also thought I wanted to make some artwork, and somehow the two came together. And I found this new way, for me, new way of combining narrative and experience. And that's what Out of Darkness is about. Started with bedtime stories, yeah. My mum would tell me stories always about the box. Both my parents talked all the time about the box. The box was something we all knew all about. But I never knew what size the box was. When I was a kid, I used to imagine the box was like my play box. And then I remember it was a very specific moment. I went to visit the Anne Frank house, and I saw what a hiding place looked like. And I thought, oh my goodness, it wasn't really a box, it was like this, it was a small apartment. I would try to draw the box with my mum together to try and get a real sense of the scale of the box. And so that's where it all started. But it soon realised that it was only a small structure and I could just build the structure. So I built it, and she came to see it and refined it further. She kept making me make it smaller. My instincts were there were 3 people living here, it must be bigger, but she made me make it smaller and smaller until she was happy with it. And I exhibited the box as a piece of artwork. But she died a couple of years later, and I thought again about exhibiting the box. And I started to explore a little. And so I dug around a little bit more, and I found a piece of writing of my father's where he described very precisely the box. But his dimensions were different to my mother's. His dimensions were smaller and shorter. And that for me was really interesting, and I knew straight away I had to make his version too. And so there were these 3 versions of the box. There was my childhood imaginings, the one I created with my mother, and my father's description. And that became the root of Out of Darkness.
Prispaustos prie sienos,
Pressed against the wall,
šautuvai atstatyti į galvas.
guns to our head,
Nebijojau numirti.
and I wasn't afraid, not of
Nemanau, kad
dying.
jie planavo mus sušaudyti.
I don't think they ever planned
Bet
to
tuo metu
shoot
tai
us,
atrodė neabejotinai tikra.
but at the time it seemed a certainty. Exhibition begins in the introduction in the pre-war period, and those stories about that time of uncertainty. And then it moves into the Soviet occupation, and I make some work about my mother's story about having been to see La Traviata and coming out of the music theatre into La Sicilea and seeing the tanks rolling down La Sicilea. This was a very striking image for her. And then there's another layer that starts at the beginning as well, which is to do with my grandfather. My grandfather, Jurgis Strom, owned a cinema called Pasaka. And I only found out relatively recently what Pasaka meant, and learned that Pasaka was the word for fairy tale. He owned a cinema called Pasaka. It was a fairy tale, and his death was a horror story. I knew I had to deal with the story of Litukis Garage and how he was killed. There's a lot of contention around Litukis, but that actually is irrelevant in this context. What's relevant is the stories I was told, and the stories she heard, and the stories that lived on in our family. And the story I heard was that they had hose pipes put into their mouths and the water blasted in, and that they were drowned from the inside and then beaten to death. So this was the horror story. And then we move, there's another important story. There's a piece which I call Hands Up, which is a story my mum used to tell about the Lithuanian partisans, white armbanders, coming into their home in the first days after the invasion and sending her and her mother and her grandmother down into the yard and making them stand with their hands against the wall. And she would always say to me, it was so strange to see my mother with her hands beautifully manicured and jewellery standing with her hands against the wall about to be shot. And then they're into the ghetto. Her father has disappeared and we move into the ghetto and there's a corridor of barbed wire, and I hope that people will walk around the corner and see that corridor and be filled with quite a visceral sense of unease, and it feels really uncomfortable, and it's those sort of stimulating those moments for an audience that are really what I'm trying to do. Then they enter into the ghetto. There's a piece which is a mirror in which you see an image of people in the ghetto, but you also see yourself reflected in it. So it's about really giving you an opportunity to put yourself in that place. The next section of the show is what I now call the games room. I wanted to find a metaphor, an experience that embodied the sense of fragility of life, the notion that the distance between being sent to the left and being sent to the right was the wave of a finger, but actually the difference between life and death. And so the whole room is around that feeling of how easily you could go to the other side. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, I think it's really important telling this story to engage people and to engage young people. And I thought that the games, it's a bit of light relief after you've been in your corridor of barbed wire to be able to play a little. And then we move into the later part of the show where we encounter both versions of the hiding place, different bits of story. We start to hear Mara's voice.
The foundry is deserted. All work has stopped. It's time to get out. We're all agreed. Joseph and mother will go to Matsanavich's right away. One glance at me reveals me as a Jew. So I must be patient for a bit longer. I'm alone here now, and time passes even more slowly. And the story unfolds. The final moment before the final moment, always been really central and really important to me, that you don't leave people with horror, but you have to offer some sense of light. And so there is what I call the barbed wire stars. There's a space where we see what looks like a sea of beautiful stars. It should be beautiful. It's made from barbed wire, but it is beautiful. Although it's a horror story, it's also a love story. And although it's a story of death and murder and horrific ends of life, it's also a story of salvation, of love, and of regeneration. And, you know, they have to balance. And that piece embodies that moment of hope and that moment of looking forward. What's the message I want to send people? I resist imposing messages on people. I want to present them with an experience, and I hope that they'll feel hopeful about humanity and careful about their actions in the future, and recognise how lucky we are to be here and to have the opportunity to help each other and to help each other to survive and to live the best possible life. That's quite a lofty ambition, but that's what I would say.